To.
Mr Speaker.
I call Grant Robertson.
Mr Speaker, well that intervention from the Minister kind of sums things up really. Couldn't find his notes, didn't know what to say and sat down after 2 or 3 minutes.
That's right.
That's the government's commitment, their rock-solid commitment to getting to the bottom of who it is who's buying houses in New Zealand. It says it all about this bill and this piece of legislation, Mr Speaker, which is all about being seen to do something. It's about the fact that public pressure has built up on the government, and so they know they have to act in some form or other. And so they put up a half-hearted, confused piece of legislation designed to make it look as if they're dealing with the question of speculators, look as if they're going to provide some decent information for us to be able to assess what's happening in the New Zealand property market, but when in reality, Mr Speaker, they have completely failed to do so. The Minister told us that he was going to take some notice of the submissions of the New Zealand Law Society, and I welcome that, and I hope that when we see those amendments we'll be able to support them. What I would ask, Mr Speaker, is that the Minister take notice of some of the other submissions that he received on this bill, or even in fact, Mr Speaker, if he would take notice of some of the advice that he received from the Inland Revenue Department, because we find ourselves as opposition members during the progress of this bill in Select Committee being the advocates for the Minister's own department. So the Inland Revenue Department in their regulatory impact statement gave a number of pieces of advice to the Minister about how this bill could be improved, and the Minister decided not to go there. Actually, my understanding, Mr Speaker, is that the Minister himself probably quite wanted to go there and quite wanted to accept the advice of his officials, but other members of Cabinet overruled him and told him that he couldn't do that and watered the bill down. Because when we look at the Inland Revenue Department's statement, the first issue that they had, Mr Speaker, is one that all of us on the Select Committee had, and that is that time constraints meant that the Inland Revenue Department weren't able to consult with potentially affected parties or estimate the compliance costs of this piece of legislation. So let's just stop and think about that for a minute, Mr Speaker. Here we are imposing a new regime on buyers of property in New Zealand, and the Inland Revenue Department tell their Minister they haven't had time to consult with the people who are affected, and they don't know what level of compliance costs are going to be imposed. That is the standard of legislation that this government is bringing back to the House today, Mr Speaker. We on the committee too felt that we were under a time pressure. We didn't get all of the information that we needed, I believe, to make this piece of legislation into what it should be. And I say this, Mr Speaker, I believe we will be back in this House within months correcting elements of this legislation, because we have not had the time as a parliament to get this right. The Minister's coming up with SOPs on the hoof that he wants to put through in the committee stages, and there will be more in the future. Mr Speaker, the other concern that the Inland Revenue Department raised, and it was raised by a large number of the submitters to the bill and also is in the minority report of the Labour and Green parties, is around the definition of the main home. The desire of the government to exempt the main home, they try to explain away in their comments in the report. But what the Inland Revenue Department said was that they didn't believe that exempting the main purchases of a main home would reduce compliance costs, as almost all those people purchasing a main home here in New Zealand would have an IRD number anyway. And that is the bottom line point. If you're going to be buying a main home, you're going to have it anyway. But rather than accept that advice from the Inland Revenue Department, the government said, no, we know best, and we're going to exclude that. And therefore, the quality of information is fundamentally compromised from the get-go in this piece of legislation by doing that. The excuse that somehow or other this was going to place this outrageous burden upon New Zealanders, that they would have to actually have an IRD number and a New Zealand bank account, is completely ridiculous. It is not justifiable at all. And the IRD, in their advice to the Minister, said that because obviously this is linked to the next piece of legislation. I know we're not supposed to talk about an upcoming piece of legislation, but the next piece of legislation, we were exactly, oh, is that right? In passing, right, is okay. The bright line test, they tried to link it up and say it was important for that reason. Mr. Speaker, the IRD have told them that is not the case. We actually believe that the exemption for the main home is actually going to increase compliance costs. It's certainly going to create loopholes in terms of the kind of data that can be collected. Mr. Speaker, we also believe that the definition of the main home within the piece of legislation is fundamentally flawed too. It's vague and it's open to interpretation. The government has come up with the idea that a person's main home should be their principal place of residence with which should be the place of residence with which they feel the greatest connection. Now, the problem with this is twofold, Mr. Speaker. The first is that that phrase, with the greatest connection, has never been used in New Zealand tax law before. Nobody actually knows exactly what it means, and there will be wholesale interpretation issues over the next few years. Mr. Speaker, if somewhere is your principal place of residence, that I believe is a clear and readily used phrase. The inconsistencies that arise from someone having a greatest connection may be that they don't necessarily live there full time. Certainly if they live in other parts of New Zealand and travel from time to time to a place which is they regard as their main home, is that the place that they have the greatest connection to? Is it where their children go to school, or is it where they work? Mr. Speaker, we teased out some of these ideas with officials, and quite frankly, the officials weren't able to answer because this has never been used before, because we've come up with a brand new definition that we believe is subject to considerable loopholes. Mr. Speaker, the IRD also told the Minister that the requirement to have a New Zealand bank account to obtain a New Zealand IRD number is unnecessary for individuals and of limited benefit, as IRD already has the power to require relevant identification verification upon application for an IRD number. The bottom line here is that the IRD number is what is the useful thing, is the thing that will actually be able to be tracked. The opening of a New Zealand bank account, well, yeah, it might be interesting, but it really doesn't tell you very much at all in terms of where somebody is resident. We had a range of issues given to us by submitters during the bill. Some submitters said to us that the requirement for a New Zealand bank account for an offshore party to obtain an IRD number is unnecessary and will provide no net benefit whatsoever. We also agreed with the IRD, who advised that in the regulatory impact statement, the bill's it's unlikely that any anti-money laundering checks carried out by a New Zealand financial institution would have any greater impact or give any greater information than IRD would already get from the provision of an IRD number. So this is the worst of both worlds, Mr. Speaker. On one hand, we've got a series of unnecessary compliance, and on the other hand, we're not actually assessing the full range of information in terms of people who purchase their main home. So what started out sounding to most members of Parliament as being a good idea turns out to be an idea full of holes, and not giving the correct, the right information that our New Zealanders would expect to see coming from the government. So, Mr. Speaker, on balance, the Labour Party members of the committee have agreed to support this bill. It at least begins the process of identifying a major gap in our information about the way that housing is purchased in New Zealand. It is inadequate. It fails the test of good legislation by being rushed through the House. It has failed to take the advice, the Minister has failed to take the advice of his own officials about how to take the strongest and best approach to getting this information. And Mr. Speaker, as a Parliament, we have a responsibility to New Zealanders, I believe, to get the best possible information about who is purchasing homes and what rate of purchase is being undertaken by foreign speculators. We know that speculators, looking at the QV data, are responsible for around 41% of the purchases of homes in the Auckland area in the last year or so. That's an interesting piece of information, but David Bennett will probably stand up and say to me, well, that's inadequate. I agree. But this bill should have been the piece of legislation that brought to the House a comprehensive register of home purchasing in New Zealand that we could all use to understand the origin of those purchases and what impact that is having on the housing market in New Zealand. Instead, Mr. Speaker, what we have is a half measure, a confused bill, which we will no doubt have to improve very soon.